Hello, welcome back to Janus Academy. This is the ongoing History of Art series, 52 or 53 lectures. We are yet to determine. This is the general introduction to history of art, and we are at number 8. This is the 8th lecture in the series. We are moving through time now with great leaps forward. We are 9,000 years before current moment, and we are talking about Ain Ghazal Jordanian figures. Now, I'm saying Jordanian, obviously, because Ain Ghazal is a settlement in today's Jordan, the country of Jordan. They have nothing to do with this country specifically, obviously, because they were made 9,000 years ago when this country didn't exist in today's form. But we connect it to its geographical location. Anyhow, this is a bit of a threshold to observe and to notice, because we are talking about a fundamentally different situation here. Now, previous installment was dedicated to cave art, and we were still talking about Paleolithic. We were talking about the old stone and a fundamentally different view of humanity, because it was still something that had to do with nomadic hunter-gatherer kind of life. What we are dealing with here is Neolithic, and here we are well within the beginning of agricultural period. We are well within something that is known as the Neolithic agricultural revolution. Essentially, and probably, and in my mind, without a doubt, the most important event that ever took place in the history of humanity. I know that this sounds quite dramatic. I know that it sounds bombastic, but it really is. It's something that fundamentally changed how we live. It changed humanity. It changed humans. Not only spiritually, not only in terms of having created civilization as we know it today, but physically changing humans. When we started being sedentary, our bodies changed to, well, conform to that difference. And a lot can be said about this. A lot can be said about how we grew smaller, weaker, stupider, how these were all findings registered by archaeologists and anthropologists, and these are really not controversial data. Pretty much everyone agrees with this. Sedentary lifestyle changed everything because we did not explore quite as much anymore. We did not hunt quite as much anymore. We started using domesticated animals. There were several different thresholds to observe here. One was, of course, agriculture, probably the most important thing that happened. The other one was animal husbandry. Once these two got together, it created, well, pretty much the society that we know today. We can't really be talking about art the same way we did previously, because, again, there's no such thing as art in this period. And this is something we're going to reiterate a couple of more times, most notably when we start talking about the Sphinx and Egyptian art, something we call art, but it really isn't. And we're going to come back to that. The whole point being here that we are talking about a profoundly different kind of humanity, profoundly different society, group, individual, how they see themselves, and everything else. This is an interesting thing because we associate the Neolithic agricultural revolution to a very specific geographical region that is today known either as Levant or the Middle East or Western Asia. All of these are equally legitimate. But if we're talking about it in historic terms, and if we're talking about it in anthropological terms, we prefer to use the term Fertile Crescent. And this is because, although most of this, well, region nowadays looks most like the desert, it was, well, fertile back in the day. It was all green, very lush. Some climatic change led to it being the way it is nowadays. However, if we want to properly understand it, we need to understand that back in the day, we're talking 10,000 years ago and then 9,000 years ago, it was drastically different. The reason why the agricultural revolution happened there was because people roaming that general area thought it was incredibly well suited for permanent settlement because there was so much resources. It was incredibly lush. And it's the reason why we have civilization as such basically grow out of this region. This is something we can trace much later if we start talking about Sumerian civilization, if we start talking about Babylonian, Egyptian, all these things. Some incredibly important things happened here. Easily, I guess, the most important things that ever happened in history of humanity happened here. I mean, if we are to talk about civilization or what we consider to be civilization in that particular optics. Now, we want to say that when we're talking about the term revolution, we know of several different revolutions, and I guess it depends on your personal point of view, how you are politically or ideologically inclined. You can think that a certain revolution is more important than the other. You can say, well, perhaps the French Revolution was more important than the American, or you can say, well, the Bolshevik Revolution was more important than both the French and the American, or you can say, well, the Chinese Revolution actually was important more than the Bolshevik. You can have these kinds of discussions, and not to get into any of them, I would argue that the other two revolutions are way more important than any of these combined. Now, we can have our American, French, Bolshevik, whatever other political and ideological revolution you want to put in the mix on one end, and then on the other we can have our Neolithic agricultural and industrial, and these are just way more important. There's not even a discussion here. And if we're talking about these two, agricultural and industrial, I would argue that agricultural is way more important than the industrial. And I know that this is something that is quite, well, how should I say, cheeky to to say and provocative, but really it has changed our lives so profoundly that we can't even begin to imagine. And this change really can be felt in every imaginable domain of existence. For example, if we're talking about ecology and if we're talking about environment preservation and all the changes that humans have exerted over, well, the entirety of the planet, by far most destructive was, well, agricultural revolution and agricultural process. I would argue way more destructive than industrial. Now, most of the pollution that we have today comes from industry, but I would argue that monoculture and basically planting one kind of crops over and over again that then impoverishes the soil is a way more dangerous practice than any kind of pollution that you can exert and that can happen in the industrial key. But not to get out of track here, we want to say that the changes that we're dealing with here are very important and something that we absolutely need to address. Now, if you think about, well, the kind of society that is being created in these circumstances, you're thinking about their expressive output, and you're thinking about what we consider from today's perspective as their art. This particular figure that we're talking about is situated anywhere between 9.5 to 8.5 thousand years ago. We can say 9,000 years, that's kind of a broad estimate. And we can say that this is something that is drastically different than any other figurine or cave painting or drawing that we have discussed thus far. It's really a drastically, well, different and special case for observation. First of all, it comes from a sedentary society. Now, if you think about a sedentary style of life and you compare it to nomadic, you can understand that that's a considerable difference not to be overlooked. If you have a sedentary lifestyle, you will then most likely build yourself some sort of a house, some sort of a settlement. You will build yourself some sort of a village, or even eventually down the line a city. Indeed, the oldest city in existence, to our knowledge at least, is Jericho, and we are talking about a city that began 10,500 years ago. It's pretty impressive. So sedentary lifestyle means that you will not roam and explore quite as much. You will have a different rhythm of life. It will be far more repetitive. It will be far more cyclical. What it also means is that, and this is kind of without exception, it means that you will be involved in agriculture. Now, this is a whole can of worms to open, and we'll try not to go too deeply into it because we have limited time. But dealing with the soil, dealing with plants in this particular manner is, well, quite different from hunting and foraging, hunting and gathering. We could argue that foraging and gathering really, well, made us discover how plants work and then made us want to act on plants, made us basically want to profit from plants and their life cycles. You could say that people who were mostly in charge of foraging, which would most likely be women, the female part of the group, was responsible for invention of agriculture and therefore the entire world that ensued. Now, again, if you're to go back to theories of Camille Paglia, who is very dear to our hearts here, she argues that we lived in this very brutal matriarchy where women were extremely oppressive of men for many reasons, for all their capacity to produce children. And that they then invented agriculture basically through foraging and through extensive knowledge of plants that they accumulated. And then when agriculture was invented, that basically gave us, circumstances that were fruitful for patriarchy to develop. And then the whole society changed in that direction. Now, this is just an interesting theory. We're not going to sit with it for too long. The whole point is that these statues and Ghazal statues, they come from an agricultural context. And this is really important if we want to properly address the materials that were made in creation of these statues, their usage, their ritualistic and cultic usage, the fact that they were used for burial rites. This is something we strongly assume. We found them basically buried. A lot is to be said about the chronology of this particular, item, and a lot is to be said about its Chtonian nature. Now, why do I say Chtonian? It's a very important word to understand. If we're looking at 19th century and then a lot of the 20th century anthropological practices and this way to systematize the world and to classify principles, we tend to fall back to this very old dichotomy, this binary division of the principles that we call solar and Chtonian. You could also broadly address them as male and female. This is something that we're going to be coming back to, either to reference it, either to criticize it, because reducing things to binary dichotomies is not always the best way to go. But generally speaking, we have the so-called solar principle, the male principle, that has to do with heaven and with the light and the sun. And we see this as a principle of violence incarnate, but a creative kind of violence, violence that is responsible for creating order, structure, the state, beauty. We were talking about the connection between violence and beauty when we were addressing some previous items. There's that entire worldview and that entire principle of creation and partially of destruction. You can say that of all of the Greek deities, because we constantly go back to Greek deities for examples, Apollo would be the greatest example for a solar principle. This is why Nietzsche calls it, broadly speaking, Apollonian. He makes the division between Apollonian and Dionysian. Now, this is not entirely the same as solar and Chtonian, but it's pretty close. The point being that on the other end of that, we have the Chtonian principle. And when I was studying here at La Sorbonne, and when my mentor was, chastising me for many mistakes I was committing in my research and in my thinking, one of the things that she insisted upon was that I make a difference between Chtonian and Telluric. Meaning that Chtonian is something that really deals with the underground, with the underworld, whereas Telluric is something that deals with the superficial strata of the soil. In this regard, the Telluric principle would have to do with agriculture, would have to do with plants, with whatever is that happens on the soil's surface, whereas the Chtonian would really have to do with Hades. Again, to go back to the Greek context, it would have to do with deep underground, that you can, of course, very easily connect to the cave, because we were talking about cave art in the previous installment, and the fact that if you were a shaman looking for ecstatic out-of-the-body experience, and if you wanted to either witness or create cave art, you had to crawl really deeply into a cave, which is a terrifying experience and all of that. The whole point being that the Chtonian has to do with the underworld. And as a principle, we see it something connected to the entire life cycle, something that has to do with death, but also revival and birth. It has to do with burial. It has to do with caves being the most Chtonian sites with very strong Chtonian energies. And the caves in this particular regard are symbolically very close to the notion of the female sexual organ and the notion of the female, womb. I guess womb is always female. It has to do with the site of birth and the site of death. It's not an accident that all of the mystery initiatory cults had to do with caves, symbolically or concretely, that Jesus was buried in the cave and then resurrected there, that Pythagoras gave his classes in a cave. They're extremely important sites. And they are, as we said previously, well, first temples or sacred spaces rather than temples that we can talk about. At least the ones that have been preserved enough for us to to be able to say that. Now, when it comes to agriculture in general and the agricultural world, well, we are far more turned towards the Chtonian principle than we were before. We deal with the soil. Again, we make a distinction between Chtonian and Telluric, but we can say that anything that has to do with burial is really important in this regard, because we have this idea of, well, agriculture, which is burying the seed of a plant, a crop we want to grow, or be it a vegetable or a crop, it doesn't really matter, that then, although buried, grows. It defeats death in a way. And this is a very interesting thing, is that you bury a seed and then it grows into a plant. And it's an interesting thing, because in order for the seed to fully release its potential, in order for the seed to truly come alive, it needs to be buried, which is symbolically, it needs to be killed. So there's this really interesting connection between life and death. And it is all the more interesting if we're talking about, well, the human burial ritual. Now, you can understand that burials are not quite the same in nomadic versus sedentary societies, because although we can talk about very elaborate burial rituals in pre-agricultural and pre-neolithic societies, we can talk about sometimes incredibly ornate burial sites, ritualistically incredibly developed, but it's just not the same if you spend your entire life very close to your dead, or if you have a cyclical nomadic pattern of movement where you can bury a certain individual, or of great or lesser importance, and doesn't matter, and you will get to pass that site 2, 3, 5, 6 times in your life. You understand that it's just not the same. This is the moment where we start burying our dead very close to where we live, and it depends on the society how close this is. Sometimes you bury your dead underneath your doorstep. It's just you want to be that close to them. There is this idea that deals with cycles. Since we deal with agriculture in this particular period of time, we are dealing with cycles, because we have to observe the cycles of nature, I would argue, far more than we ever did before. We have a vested interest in natural cycles, because we want to know when to properly plant the seed, when to properly harvest the seed. We want to, well, fully understand how these things work so that we can survive. It's a very important thing. Now, of course, that we were aware of the cycles before, because we would have to be aware of how the animal herds, animals that we hunt, how they move. We would have to be aware of plants that grow in the wilderness. They have their own cycles as well, but it becomes very different when you become sedentary, and you cannot just move to another period where resources have grown anew, where they are replenished. When you are stuck in one place, the whole thing becomes far more important. And then you can understand that this whole burial business, well, it becomes far more important than it ever was, and that you grow an attachment to your dead in a very different manner. Because again, there is this symbolical connection between the burial of your dead, of your ancestors, and what you do with seeds. There is this very interesting idea of a sacrificial mechanism that is inherently present in, let's say, how we treat wheat or general corn. This idea that, you have, let's say, wheat growing, then you harvest the wheat and you take 9/10 of that, you crush it into flour, so you use it. But then 1/10 you will replant. So you will, again, symbolically destroy it by burying it, because it's burial and it is very close to human burial, and then it grows again. So this allows us to think that perhaps our dead grow in a certain way. Then you think about Christianity and our association between Jesus and bread, and this whole idea of how Jesus defeated death by resurrecting. So you think, yes, if you bury a grain of wheat, then it resurrects in a way, and it assumes new life that is much more impressive than the previous life. Because you think about a little grain of wheat, it produces, well, the whole plant that can grow many different other grains. It's a way of defeating death. It's a way of basically perpetuating life. And this is exactly what Christ's promise to humanity is, that through his path we defeat death. You can see how the whole thing is agricultural in its essence. But we are talking now, of course, about something that is situated 9,000 years in the past. We can't really be talking about Christianity too far in the past to do that. But we are talking about agricultural lifestyle, and we are talking about these particular statues being very agricultural in their nature. And this is something that we want to address, because I would argue it makes perfect sense that their shape and their general disposition, the stylization that was used, their facial expression, it all points to this lifestyle, especially the materials that were used to make them. Now, we were talking about burials so much because these were burial fetishes, because these statues were made to be buried. They were not made to be a statue that would be used, let's say, like a Greek or a Roman statue that would be placed inside a temple or in front of a temple, where we would have votive offerings to it and all the rest of it. No, this was made to be buried, and it was made in a way also to be destroyed. There's a very good evidence of these statues being made with great care, again with great skill, great technique, I would add, of the materials that were also agricultural in nature and that were available to these people, but then they were destroyed and buried. So this makes us think that these figures were, in a way, fetishes in the, how should I say, in the most appropriate way imaginable. A fetish being an inanimate object that is infused with spiritual properties. I would argue that these people stood for actual people, and that they were buried either by them or instead of them, which is an incredibly interesting thing. Now, I want to say that the connection we have with our dead, the growing connection that we have with our dead, really has everything to do with sedentary lifestyle and with agriculture. Because if you, let's say, use the ritual of burial in a nomadic society, you just don't get to grow that big of an attachment as you do in a sedentary society, because your ancestor that you buried is physically not close to you. You can feel a spiritual proximity, and you can feel some sort of connection that goes and happens in that plane of existence, but it's just not the same if you have, well, your father or your grandfather or your great-grandfather buried underneath your doorstep. So there's this immediacy that is really important. There's this idea that we share the same space. And if you get into ethnography or ethnology and anthropology, I mean, there's so many customs that indicate that we have a growing and evolving relationship with our dead, that we have all these customs that are made so that the dead still feel welcome in our world. We have these, feasts and holidays and celebrations where we tend to include the dead. And we want them not to feel alone and not to feel abandoned. We want to keep continuing maintaining our connection with them. And we can argue that these statues, well, they are ritualistic and they're cultic in this particular regard. They serve to maintain the connection between the living and the dead. And this is all very interesting, because we can then think back to the whole idea of the sacred as we think it was formulated in the Paleolithic period, where we thought about the great hunt, where we thought about, well, hunting the animal, cave paintings, statues that could either represent faces of animals or of humans. And we can think about this whole connection in terms of materials used between living matter and inanimate matter, bone and stone. Now you think about this particular statue, it is made of a very peculiar material. So we're talking about lime plaster and reeds. Now these are all, plant-based, and this is an interesting thing, because back in the day we would either have stone or we would have, mammoth tusk or bone. And when it comes to cave paintings, we would have, pigment that was used. Now, these are all peculiar materials. We do not use plants. But since we're talking about agricultural period, we are talking about plants. Now, why is this so interesting to us? Well, if we assume that those Paleolithic statues were mirroring humanity in a certain way, either as representations of humans or either as representations of gods, we would think about the body of a god having to do with stone or having to do with bone. And we would think about the sacred being invested in a transitory state between life and death. And not to repeat the whole thing with bone, how you have to kill an animal to take their bone. So that's all been said. Here we are making these idols, I would argue, or votive figures or just fetishes. We're making them out of plant-based material, which is to say that if we are making replicas of ourselves and if we are making funerary figures, because again, we're burying these statues, we are no longer making it out of stone. We are not using stone as the material that is to mimic human existence. We are not using animal bone that is to mimic human existence, either as something that is better than we are, either as something that is just a substitute. No, now we're using plants. And this opens up a whole line of inquiry about vegetative eroticism that we may get to address, superbly interesting thing, that we make bodies of our gods, if you will, or our ancestors, or indeed our own bodies, we make them from plants. And why is this such a big deal? Well, we said that most of the diet of a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer was obtained through foraging, that we didn't really hunt for food, not nearly as much as we did for ritual and for rites of initiation and all these other things. Arguably 80 or 85% of Paleolithic humans was obtained by foraging, the gathering part in hunter-gatherer's diet. In this particular case, we can say that, most of the food was obtained through agriculture. And we can argue that this is the case because we observe great difference in how bone density reduced, how muscular density was reduced, how people grew to be shorter, how we started having, dental issues that we never had before, how this new kind of food degraded us in pretty much any conceivable way, because our entire feeding pattern changed. But the point is that our imagination also changed, our idea of who we were changed, because we didn't make our bodies to be made of stone or bone anymore. We didn't make bodies of potentially our idols to be of stone and bone. No, we made it out of reed. That's a very different kind of material. I mean, that's a material that doesn't last. And it's not supposed to last. Now, we are getting to the point that is, I think, to me personally, amazing when it comes to these particular statues. And that is the fact that these were not made to last. They were made to be temporary. Now, what is the deal with this? Well, you think about one of the things we mentioned talking about cave paintings and it's their longevity, how it's, truly incredible that some of these cave paintings lasted 15,000 years or 20,000 years, or some recent discoveries situate some of these to 40 and 50,000 years in the past. Just having a thing, a painting of all things last that long is pretty incredible in itself. But you could argue that material is used in everything. It was made to last. If you use stone to make a statue, it's made to last. Stones are incredibly durable. And again, we have these stone figurines that go back hundreds of thousands of years in the past. Millions even, when it comes to the first item in our research. But these were not made to last. Quite specifically, if you think about reeds and if you think about plaster, they're not, durable materials. And if we think about these statues having been made and then having been broken intentionally and then buried, it's clear that they were used for those rituals specifically. Again, they were not meant for longevity. Now, when we were talking about Lovenmensch and some other figurines, we were talking about how much time it took to create them, how much skill it took, and how people back in the day had less time than we have today, so their time was more valuable. And this is, a great effort that was invested in creation of something that obviously had great importance. When we're talking about these, we can say that they're done with great skill, with great care, considerable talent, but that they were never made to last. And since we were talking about the possibility of better understanding of all of these things if we compare them to modern and contemporary circumstances. We can also make a comparison between, late 19th, early 20th century art, generally all of 20th and all of 21st century art, with these statues. You could argue that from Impressionism onwards, art, especially paintings, were not necessarily made to last. They were made to be consumed and then, I wouldn't say forgotten or thrown in the trash, but basically no effort was made so that they could last. And I made this comparison between a medieval painting in the Louvre that comes from the 13th century and needs no special protection, no special preservation, as compared to an early 20th century, let's say an Impressionist painting in the Orsay Museum that needs all the possible protection because it's just not as well done. You think about this statue, it was never meant to last. I mean, not even a couple of days. It was made, then broken, then buried. Its function was exhausted in its ritual, the burial ritual, as we assume. And that's a very different idea of art, because we tend to value, especially in the Western perspective, longevity of art. We tend to say, if a work of art is good, then it's going to last a very long time. It's going to be universal. We're going to be able to find value in it, even when the era in which that work of art was made changes, even when the general dominant ideas of the world change. But there's something about universality of that work of art that it's going to continue, that is going to make it relevant for the future. But again, these were never made to last, possibly because they were never meant to be art, considered in any kind of shape or form that art can manifest itself. These were, made for ritual. And this is quite an interesting thing, because it takes me back to the moment when I was a student, to the time when I was taking an exam on culturology, which was the name of the class, something in between anthropology and, cultural studies. And I was asked about the myth and ritual, and I was asked to say which comes first. And I said ritual, which was, a lucky guess back in the day. Yeah, and the professor agreed with me that ritual is something that comes first. Well, it wasn't entirely a lucky guess, but whatever. The whole thing is that this idea that we have an action that comes before the rationalization of that action. Now, why am I talking about this? Well, we see myth as the source of all art. We see myth as mostly the tendency to explain the world, our curiosity and our creative inquisition into the nature of things, that we want to understand how the world works. We don't necessarily have the scientific tools to analyze it, and so we invent stories. This is how the myth goes. Now, what my professor was trying to underline and make us understand is that the actual action of the ritual comes first, that we do something, that we dance around the fire, or we create a mask, or we have an ecstatic out-of-the-body experience, or we turn into an animal, or all these other things that were ritualistically done, and that comes first. So an action comes before the story, which was the whole point. Now, if we think that myth is, the source of all of art, so there's a clear connection, and I mean, the influence of myth on art is well documented, let's just put it that way. One of our lectures in the series of What is Art is entirely dedicated to this, and then in other lectures we keep coming back to that question. So we say that art grows out of myth and myth grows out of ritual. There's a clear connection between them, and you can say that a lot of the ritualistic materials that were used were recontextualized much later to be the works of art. Now, this is the whole story. Again, we go back to Picasso. We just can't seem to shake this guy. And how Picasso was amazed by African art. And now what he considered to be African art was not art at all. So those were fetishes that were seen as sacred by those people. But he thought them aesthetically amazing. And then he basically based his entire style on them. Not just him. You can say the same thing about Modigliani and many other people. The whole primitivism thing. And the idea is that we see something that has ritualistic, meaning sacred usage and value, and we basically want to secularize it, and we want to recontextualize it and turn it into the work of art. Now, when we're talking about these statues, when we use the term statue, we are talking about it from the 21st century perspective that is strongly influenced and shaped by the late 18th century perspective that seeks to secularize the whole notion of art. This is, again, when we start having the whole philosophical branch of aesthetics. This is when we start thinking about art for its own sake, as Kant argues all art should be. This is when we try to divorce art from the sacred. These are obviously all impulses that have shaped the entire Enlightenment period. And we are still kicking those ideas around. We are still not able to shake that from ourselves. That we insist that we should be looking at art in a secular key. You go to a museum, again, you see a painting that was never made for a museum, it was made for a church, but you don't really think about it. You think about that particular piece not as an icon, but as a painting. Now, I'm talking about all of this yet again, and I'm going to be talking about it yet again in the lectures that are to come, because it's really important to understand that these statues were not, well, statues at all. They were made as fetishes that were used in a very sacred rite of burial. And this rite, this ritual, was made all the more sacred by the sedentary lifestyle that these people adopted. And then the, very usage and the very material they used basically told us about their lifestyle and basically told us about the whole cycle of existence and how it had to do with agricultural circumstances. Now, I want to say something about longevity, because it's such an important thing that the whole idea of agricultural life, of sedentary life, makes us, inhabit a certain place and grow roots in a way, get attached to that particular space. We start having a different idea of chronology, of time, of measuring time, of building a society in a way. A society that is also sedentary. We tend to remove ourselves from the general flux of nature and the general nomadic migratory pattern that most animals have and most humans had back in the day. Now, arguably, you could talk about migrations. That's a whole field of study, and people, of course, still migrate and travel, and like all of these things still happen, but not really in the same manner as it happened, thousands of years ago. You could argue that today you can migrate from one sedentary settlement to another, but you're not really spending your life migrating. You're not on the road, you're not on the path most of the year. It's really like in between sedentary settlements for most of it. But the point is that we are talking about how these were shaped and how we started having a very different idea of our bodies, of our souls, of our communities. And we started having this idea, of larger and larger communities. Because if you're on the move, your community cannot be terribly large. I mean, you just cannot sustain it while you're traveling. So your community is much more compact. You can't really be carrying all that food around. Now, if you are sedentary, you can have surplus of food, you can have stocks and reserves. And again, that changes everything, because then you have the whole idea of wealth appear. Then you have the whole idea of separation of labor and separation of professions. You get specialized to do something far more than was the case back in the nomadic hunter-gatherer society. That changes everything. And what I'm trying to say is that these faces and these statues are a good sign of that. Now, why did I say a face? Well, obviously, I was trying to jump ahead of my own story here. When we look at these statues, we can see that they have fairly detailed faces and fairly detailed bodies. And this is a thing that, appears, I wouldn't say for the first time, but appears as a sort of a novelty, really. Because we think about all the things that we've mentioned thus far. In the previous 7 lectures, we were talking either about fairly well-designed bodies or fairly well-designed faces. I mean, as much as they could have been. And when we're talking about cave paintings, we talk about great emphasis on animals rather than on humans. And this is the moment where we start having, very well-formed bodies with painted-on eyes, which is quite interesting to see the face that is made from plaster, and it has one singular sculpting mannerism to it, but then eyes are added on. And then we think back to this whole premise that eyes are the window to the soul, and we think that the mass of the head really is made of plaster, so nose and mouth and the general shape of the face, that's all made of plaster, but then eyes are added. Quite interesting. I will let you interpret this any way you want. The point being that faces are fairly well developed, bodies are fairly well developed. We have roughly 15 of these statues. They come in different forms. They're much larger than the statues that we were talking about. One of them is in the Louvre, and it's roughly, I would say, 80, 90 centimeters of height. So it's not really a real size, but it's not that far from it. Thinking of people back in the day being much smaller than people are today. Interestingly enough, some of these come with two heads. We have two heads attached to one body. We have very long necks, and we have, well, bodies that are stylized in an incredibly, I would say, contemporary manner. There's something incredibly modern about these 9,000-year-old statues that makes them communicate so well with avant-garde and modern art. And that's a very interesting connection to be made because, as we were saying, these were not made to last. A lot of the modern contemporary art was not made to last. We can say that the generally industrial context of modern and contemporary art has a lot to do with hyper-production that has then to do with hyper-consumption. And the works of art that are created in that context are reflective of that. So the works of art are made to be consumed in a way, in a similar manner as they were produced, meaning hyper-produced. Now, we cannot really talk about that here because this is not the industrial context, this is the agricultural context, but it is basically planting the seed for that kind of society because these are the beginnings of social stratification, these are the beginnings of wealth, just the idea of private property, or really any kind of property, that did not exist before. And this cannot be understated, that for the most of our existence, that again can be measured either as being 100,000 years or 800,000 years, anyhow you want to frame it, but most of our existence, we did not have a notion of property. It just didn't exist. It's something that can be, well, talked about in the previous 10 to 12,000 years, which is a very, very small part of, well, overall timeline of humanity. And this is a thing to understand here. Now, I would like to just quickly compare both the face and the body to faces and bodies that were present in the prehistoric figures. And why do I want to do that? Well, because the amount of detail that is given to these faces, which is, I would say, considerable for its time period, really makes us think of another cult that is extremely important and that goes back to later Upper Paleolithic, and this is the skull cult. This is the idea that we want to maintain the skull as a separate thing, so not the entire body of our ancestors, but just the skull. There is a very interesting study that's called From Skull Cult to Christianity that was written by Oleg Mandic. It's a very good sweeping analysis from this, well, very from one period to the other, how the whole thing developed, how the idea of communication with our ancestors, of spirituality, of civilization, of our community, how all of those things developed and how they led to Christianity. Now, what I'm talking about here is the Upper Paleolithic to Lower Neolithic bridge, and the bridge that basically connects two very different lifestyles, nomadic and sedentary. But there is a bridge connecting them, and this is basically the idea of heads being more important than the rest of the body, because that's where our brains are, and all of our identity, or so we think, is mostly situated in our brains. And again, all of the most important perceptive organs like eyes, ears, etc. are on our faces, very close to our brains. Therefore, if we separate the skull from the rest of the body, we give it a special kind of importance. When we look at these faces, we can see, again, eyes that are painted on. They are given special kind of attention, and they're made to stand out from the rest of the figurine. Now, it's this whole idea that we like to separate, well, skulls, and therefore, in a way, we separate ourselves, again, from nature. We go back to that whole thing. If you separate the skull, basically, from the rest of the body, and you want to keep the skull at a prominent place, this means that you're separating, well, the brain carrier, in a way. So it's as if you're separating the face and the brain and the whole notion of identity from the general flux of nature. And it's your attempt to preserve this, your attempt to be close, again, to your ancestors. Now, it translates to this particular situation and these statues. I mean, I'm talking about one of these statues because we're going to use one of these as an example, but I'm just saying it's a group of 15 statues, so just bear that in mind. We're talking about these being fetishes that are used in burials and are used for burials that were never meant to last, but still they were made so that we could maintain this connection with our ancestors. And again, you make these statues, you break them into pieces, then you bury them, in most likelihood very close to the actual burials that happened, and then you live in their vicinity. It's how we've buried our dead for thousands of years. It's only very recently, I mean, I would argue in the late 18th century when we started to have a growing awareness of hygiene and sanitation and all these things, is that we started to remove cemeteries away from settlements. But then settlements grew, so they reached those previously removed cemeteries, and then we've kind of made cemeteries living spaces again, or we have living space around cemeteries again. I mean, you can see this in Paris, for example, with cemeteries of Montmartre, or Père Lachaise or Montparnasse. You can see that they're on the outskirts of the city, but then as the city grew and kind of developed, we have people, living right next to Père Lachaise or right next to Montparnasse or Montmartre Cemetery. You get the point. It's like you can't really escape from your dead, and the very development of your settlement will eventually bring you close to it and close the cycle and close the loop anew. It's basically the idea that you want to be close to your ancestors and you want to be in an uninterrupted cycle with them. Now, if you look at these, next to the fact that some of them have two heads, and that could be because they were trying to reinforce the idea of togetherness or couples, which I think is really cute and romantic. Togetherness, like a really important thing for the community. They mostly have no sexual organs. We can say that some of them are clearly women, some of them are children, some of them are men, and women are recognizable by their breasts, which is another interesting thing, because if you compare this then to a lot of the Paleolithic Venuses that we were talking about, a lot of them have very well present developed breasts. I mean, the one we chose, Venus of Lespuge, really was the most breasted of these figures, though the other ones are not far behind. The famous Venus of Willendorf has very, very large breasts. For whichever reason, these people seem to place high importance in breasts. They were really a big deal, and this is how they chose to differentiate men from women, by a large breasts rather than true genitals, which is an interesting choice. We want to go back to this whole idea of burying an actual individual or burying a copy of that individual, burying a fetish, of how interesting this is. Because if we're talking about separation from nature, we're talking about, in a way, removal of humanity from nature. Here we have a sort of an idea of duplication, that you're burying a model body, kind of a puppet, really, again, a fetish, instead of an actual body, or you're burying it next to the actual body. This is a very interesting thing to address. And I want to bring this together with the whole notion of destruction, the fact that these were made to be destroyed and then buried. Are we talking about some sort of sacrificial ritual here? If we are talking about intentional destruction, and there's a lot of evidence to point in that direction. Is it the anthropomorphic form, it's very poorly worded, the form of human, that has something to do with destruction because of inherent violence of humans? Is it because of sedentary lifestyle that brings forth the whole notion of the sacrifice and the cyclical nature of sacrifice that happens both with slaughtering of animals that we use for animal husbandry and for all of the plants that we use? Is it connected to, again, slaughtering of animals and then usage of plants that we also destroy so we could eat them? Is this connected to the fact that this whole body is made of plants? I mean, the body of the statue. Now, if you think about, let's say, simians, monkeys, some of them share, if I'm not mistaken, up to 98% of DNA, or perhaps even 99, with humans. There's very, very small genetic difference between monkeys and humans. And then again, you can think about corn, and I think corn shares 65% of DNA with humans. Now, this is kind of funny because we don't really see ourselves as very close to corn, but these people may have. Not necessarily corn, because it didn't really exist in this part of the world, but you get the point. Wheat or barley or any other grain that did exist in this part of the world, and these people did use. Perhaps they were aware of, similarity that existed, and this then takes us back to animism, this whole idea that it's the same spirit running through all of life forms. I am, of course, talking about this in the context of history of art, and I am talking about the importance of material, that the choice of material tells us a lot about not necessarily the artistic intent, but of the general scope of meaning of the work of art we're talking about. Artistic intent is not something that has to define the work of art. They can intend one thing and do a completely different, and in most cases that turns out great for the work of art itself. But I am talking about the choice of material being very important. Now, another thing about this is that we were talking about this whole idea of animals and animal worship and shamanism and totemism, of how animals are psychopomps. Psychopomp means a soul guide. Psyche is like the soul, your being, your spiritual identity, and the pomp, like the ideas of a guide. So it's psychopomp is the guide of the soul. And we said that for cave paintings, they were a very important part of shamanistic rituals, and they represented animals as psychopomps. And we have all these evidence of theriomorphic divinities, where we had animals or animal-human hybrids act as psychopomps. Here, we have a completely different thing. These are obviously human figures. And we have this idea that, again, since this is a burial rite that we're talking about, that we have our ancestors as our psychopomps. And this is something that persists, I would say, to this day, this whole cult of ancestors in many different societies. The fact that we don't necessarily go to animals or to, supreme divinity. It's the cult of ancestors. It's this uninterrupted line of existence that we want to, maintain as far into the past as possible. You could argue that certain aristocratic families of Europe still like to boast they can trace their lineage back to, 1st or 2nd century BCE, or 9th or 10th century CE. So, like, the further you can go into the past, the better it is, the more noble you are. And we can say that, yes, again, this is something that has to do with sedentary society. But this whole idea that ancestors now take this lofty role, this all-important role of psychopomps away from animals, is very, very interesting. Now, if we're talking about how these statues were found, they were buried on a transversal that went from east to west. And this is all important. I mean, this cannot be overstated. Because if we're talking about the east-west transversal, we are talking, of course, about sunrise and the sunset. Sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. If you're thinking about churches and the way churches are made in the canonic key, meaning throughout the medieval period and the Renaissance and onward up until the modern times, the church is always made to look to the east. You're always entering the church from the west and you're moving towards the altar, which is facing the east. It's looking to the east. And this is a very important thing because it has to do with light distribution. It has to do with where the light is coming from. It has to do with the symbolism of light being divine, being the spirit, and all of these things. Now, this is, again, something that we want to connect to, the general usage and then value and then role of these statues in their society. And we want to go back, because we're running out of time here, we have less than 3 minutes, we want to go back to this whole idea of ritual being at the source of everything here. It's the ritual that is really the source of myth, and then the myth is the source of art. If we were talking about these particular statues, the way they look, the way they were used, we are talking about destruction as being a very important part of that ritual. And then this makes you think about all of the works of modern art that were meant to be destroyed. You think about all those impressionist paintings that were not made to last. You think about that famous work of art by Banksy that self-destructed the minute it was sold. I don't know if you remember this. It happened a couple of years ago. Again, this is filmed in February of 2026. And this happened, I think, 5 or 6 years ago. I'm not sure. That a certain little painting was sold at an auction, and the moment it was sold, the mechanism in the frame of the painting was activated, so it shredded the painting itself inside. And then, of course, this made it far more valuable. It basically made it 10 times more expensive the minute it happened. There's this famous banana that was glued to the wall that was then eaten, that made it far more valuable. And there is one of my favorite examples, the first unintentional work of art that was self-destructive, again, to my knowledge, is the Jericho's Raft of Medusa. You can go to the Louvre Museum and see it disappearing before our eyes. Because of the paint that was used, it was industrially made paint back from the time where they didn't really fully master the whole paint production procedures, so the paint was not of very good quality, and it's growing darker little by little every day, and it's basically ultimately going to disappear. All of the painting is going to be black. This is irreversible. We don't know how to stop it, so yeah, enjoy Raft of Medusa while it's still there. It has really, really dark sections, so you can see that it wasn't made that way. It was not intended. But again, if you think about Banksy and you think about how it adds to the whole experience, the fact that it's slowly disappearing, you can then go back to the burial rites in which these statues were used, and you can think about them destroying them intentionally and how this is a really big deal. I think we are basically done. We are out of time. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to let you know that the next work of art is going to be the Sphinx. Now, we are moving out of the deep prehistory into, well, a lot of what is registered written history, because the Sphinx is going to be 4,600 years old. And this is, well, the time in which we can start talking about history. So we are moving out of prehistory into history. This has been a great leap forward. I hope this made sense. I hope you have a better understanding of just how big the transition that we're talking about is. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again soon. Bye.